A new federal policy just gave the green light for workers to openly share their religion on the job, and it's sparking plenty of conversation. Is it a boost for free expression or a recipe for awkward break room moments? Let's see what our panelists have to say in just a moment. Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists that we have with us today. Joy Mosley, Associate Vice President of Government and Strategic Relations Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. We also have Dr. Andrew Polk, who's a professor of history at Middle Tennessee State University and the author of the critically acclaimed book, Faith and Freedom, Propaganda, Presidential Politics, and the Making of an American Religion. We have Ms. Jennifer Woods, who's the General Counsel and Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have Dr. Wilmer Leon, a nationally syndicated columnist and a regular contributor to national and international television news programs and newspapers. Great having you here with us today, ladies and gentlemen. Looking forward to our show. You know, there's a new federal policy where workers for the U.S. federal government are now allowed to try to convince coworkers to join their religion and to evangelize about how their own personal religions are correct. Some think this is a horrendous assault on every person's right to be left in peace while at work, as well as an assault on every person's right to have their own individual spiritual or non-spiritual beliefs be respected. This memo is supposed to ensure that federal offices are welcoming to Americans of all faith, but it may be exactly the opposite of what's going on and what's going to happen. Instead, a policy like this may lead to many people to feel significantly less welcome, including if their faith is in the minority or otherwise. You know, when I take a look at this conversation, Andrew, one of the things that we always thought was wherever you went to work, you didn't have to worry about whether or not you had to fight for your faith because you were always going to be in a position where this was not going to be part of the conversation. But now there's a federal policy that's allowing it. I mean, not to be funny, but there are people who knock on my door with religious things and I try to close the curtain so I don't have to deal with it. But if I'm at work, that's a whole different set of circumstances. What do you think about this particular policy and how do you think this is going to play out?
Oh, this is a doozy. I think that, right, when we're balancing, and I do think there is generally a balance of freedom of expression and the way that works in terms of power and comfort in a workplace. So I'm actually not opposed, right? I think it's perfectly fine. I work at a state university. It's perfectly fine for someone to say, right, we were at church or we had a church event yesterday. I don't even think it's necessarily a problem in a passive way to, you put a cross on your desk. That's an aspect of your faith. You can decorate. That's all right. I think it becomes more problematic when that's supervisors. In this case, it's not just that. It's not just I can be a person having my own personal faith. So Scott Cooper, who's the director of the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, in response to this said that every federal worker should be able to, in the workplace, explain, quote, why his faith is correct and why the non-adherent should rethink his religious beliefs. No, the idea that at work you should be protected to proselytize, but if they say I don't want you to, well, then you stop, and then it becomes harassment. There is your second question of how this is going to play out. Horribly. It's going to play out horribly. There is no chance that the way that this generally works with living human beings that you say you can go and proselytize your coworkers, that won't regularly come up with major issues in the workplace. It's also pretty clear from the administration that their goal here is not to allow freedom of expression for all religious beliefs. It seems pretty clear this is a Christian aspect, and that's supposed to protect Christians in the workplace. So there's lots of problems in this, and I think there will be even more going forward.
I couldn't agree more. The memo states that employees may initiate religious conversations with coworkers, including the attempt to persuade others. Proselytizing is the fastest way to make somebody very uncomfortable. And they talk about this gentle attempt at persuasion. How is that to be defined? One of the three things you're told that you're not supposed to do in mixed company, you're not supposed to discuss religion, politics, or personal finances. Again, this is, once again, Christians overstepping the boundary. Yes, we do have a freedom of speech. We do have a freedom of religion. But contrary to the beliefs of the likes of Franklin Schaeffer or Jerry Falwell, these freedoms are not absolute. Thomas Jefferson advocated for the separation of church and state and talked about the importance of individual conscience, not collective conscience. And with these liberties that they are claiming to be protecting, you do have the liberty to do, but you also have the liberty to be free from doing. And you are able to do so long as your rights don't infringe upon mine. You are free to smoke until your lungs fall out. But when your secondhand smoke endangers my life, that's where your liberty stops. This is as wrong as the day is long.
Joy, you do a lot of work with Christian colleges and universities, so therefore a lot of the students that attend are expecting to, quote unquote, feel a certain amount of activity from a religious perspective. But even on our Christian college and university campuses, there's still kind of a little bit of flexibility that there may be some aspects of the religious aspect going on campus that it's not necessarily pushed on you in a way. You're kind of allowed to still choose that. And I think this kind of takes us even a little bit further when you start talking about federal government policy. I never thought I'd see anything like this.
Well, I think that this guidance is an attempt to remediate a harm that has been, people have not felt comfortable bringing any aspect of their faith into work. They've not felt comfortable talking about it. They've not felt comfortable mentioning a small group or a Bible study or church on Sunday. And there's been problems with, on your desk, you can have all sorts of things. You can have pictures, you can have all these things. But if you have a cross or if you have some religious symbol, that's not okay. So I think this guidance is an attempt to address that kind of particular harm and say, no, it actually is okay for you to bring your faith into the workplace in an appropriate way, which I think we could kind of maybe disagree about how well this guidance kind of navigates that. But it does mention that you can't harass people. You cannot keep talking about your religion to the point where it's unwelcome to others. And it also specifies that someone saying, I am not interested in hearing this, cannot be subject to discipline for not being welcoming to your religious advances. So I agree that the proselytization aspect might go a little further than we would feel comfortable with. But I do think it's remedying a specific harm that has been a real harm. And will folks go too far in trying to push their beliefs on others? I sincerely hope not, but I imagine that unfortunately a few folks will try to do that.
The issue that I have with this is really that I think it muddies the water more than it needs to, right? Like it's not clear because no one was ever prohibited from bringing their faith to the workplace before, right? I think Andrew kind of mentioned that, like no one was prohibited from talking about the fact that they went to church on Sabbath or from talking about the fact that, they had prayer meeting that evening or whatever it was. And so if the purpose of this was to clarify so that people had a better understanding of what the guidelines were as far as the appropriateness of talking about religion in the workplace, that would be one thing. But here it's encouraging more discussion of religion, and I think it will make people, extremely uncomfortable. And I think that Andrew also touched on another point, and that is the point with supervisors, right? How likely is it that a subordinate is going to tell a supervisor, I don't want to hear about religion, please don't proselytize to me, and not feel that their job or responsibilities or potential for promotion is going to be impacted by that. I think that to the extent that this guidance was trying to clarify things or make this a more welcoming space, I don't think that it reached that aim, if that was in fact the aim of this guidance.
Well, Wilmer, I think that they're trying to find this, balance, which is what Joy is kind of leaning into. I mean, I can't have a cross on my desk. I shouldn't keep a Bible on my desk because it gives certain statements. This may not have been what I would call the most artful way of going about it, but it seems as though what they're really trying to do is say that there should be space for it and you're supposed to stop. But then the reality is we know there's always going to be some bad apples who are going to go overboard. But maybe this is just a start and it'll eventually kind of find its balancing legs to make this work. Or do we not think that we've got even a shot of making that happen?
I think you're being very generous in your description. It states including attempts to persuade others of the correctness of their own religious views.
There's
awkward. A huge difference between what's the word? When you put
iconography.
Thank you. That and attempting to correct my religious beliefs, and to the management issue. So during my performance review, I've got to sit and listen to, so Wilmer, have you heard the word today? Absolutely not. This is, again, a solution looking for a problem.
I think the word that I think all panelists have used in this that's helpful is appropriateness, right? That's not clearly defined, right?
Yeah.
We have to admit that's gray, that's difficult to understand.
Yeah.
But again, I think there's a clear difference between what I would call a passive aspect of your life, right? So if we're not talking about religion, in the same way, if you're at a workplace, you can talk about sports, right? So college football and the playoffs are coming up. But there's a difference between saying, I root for Vanderbilt and I wish they had gotten into the playoffs, and someone saying, well, I'm a fan of Alabama, and me just calling them a dumb piece of bleepity bleep. How could you do? No, Alabama's the worst. Well, of course, those are different things. It's not apples to apples, but there is a vast difference in appropriateness of saying, I can have a Bible on my desk. I can say, oh, my kids were at Sabbath school and they went through, or we went to a Bible study, and saying, have you given your life to the Lord Jesus Christ? Do you know that if you don't, you are going to burn in hell forever? And I believe that you have. That jumps 3 sharks in going to appropriateness here. And again, it seems like the direction of this is not, you have your personal faith and that's how you live as a human being in the workplace and you can live that way. I think that's appropriate and should be done. This is clearly trying to go to another end, and proselytizing has generally been the sense of, we understand that's the level of appropriate.
I think this legislation could have done away with that language or this policy referring to trying to correct somebody else in their own beliefs. I do think that that's a step forward in a bridge that none of us want to be on. I do think trying to figure out how to allow an individual to properly be able to demonstrate that who they are to some degree is part of who they are from a religious perspective, but trying to find a way to do that, and that's where the issues really come. Sometimes the creation of policy almost creates even more confusion than just allowing people to kind of find their footing on their own. But hopefully when this is all said and done, we'll find a balance that hopefully will work for all parties. Coming up, a therapist is at a risk of losing her license while refusing to turn away children and families seeking counsel on gender identity issues. Don't miss the discussion. We'll be right back. When faith and government collide, the issues can be complex and consequential. Faith in Politics explores how religious conviction intersects with law, policy, and public life, offering depth, balance, and clarity with meaningful discussion and trusted insight. To see a bunch of our previous episodes, check us out at faithandpolitics.tv and subscribe to us on YouTube. There's a powerful case out there that's called Chiles versus Salazar, in which recent years we're now seeing an explosion in the number of children that are identifying as transgender. Many of these children have been led down the path of some gender transition, enduring a regimen of drugs and hormones and surgeries that sometimes cause some profound regret and sometimes permanent health harms. These harms are so significant that 25 states and several European countries have banned or strictly limited gender transitions for children, advocating instead for compassionate counseling for their distress. However, in Colorado, they banned this approach. They want to force therapists like Kaley Chiles to be able to turn away children and families from the risk of losing their license and suffering crippling fines. You know, when we take a look at this particular case, Jennifer, one of the things that kind of caused me to wonder is you have people who actually have been trained to engage in certain aspects of healthcare. And it seems as though they've gone through some training and understand the best ways in which to go about it. But there seems to be always some political or legal issue that wants to come in and shape it. And it seems like we have a situation here where we have Ms. Chiles who's trying to engage in certain activity, but then the state of Colorado comes in and wants to pump the brakes or in some degree even reshape the whole conversation. And I'm not sure if that's the way to go, or maybe this is just the world that we're living in today.
Yeah, I mean, I find this case to be a little bit troubling, especially from the standpoint of Ms. Chiles being a therapist, right? And the state telling her what kind of therapy she can engage in, what is considered medically appropriate, and what is harmful and what isn't. And it causes unease on my part, right? And the fact that a minor can get this kind of therapy if it's in a religious setting from a pastor, but the moment it's done by a therapist, now it's a harm that the state has to intervene in. That's a little bit troubling to me as well. And then, the background of all of this, we see this exponential rise in the number of youth that are being diagnosed with gender dysphoria, right? Like a 300% increase from 2017 to 2021. And it makes me wonder, why is there this increase? What are we to do with this? And why are certain jurisdictions saying, hey, there's only one way to treat this, and that is through affirming it? It just raises a lot of questions for me. And I don't think that that this is the best path forward.
Joy, when I look at these type of circumstances, it makes me wonder, there's got to be better paths forward. And what's the problem with allowing multiple ways of going about these things?
Right, exactly. I think that's one of the key problems with this law in Colorado is that it only allows one approach that is really new. I mean, the gold standard for decades was an approach called watchful waiting, where when children came forward with gender dysphoria, you would watch the patient, kind of observe, and then typically over puberty, a large number of those children would grow out of that, and then some would not, of course. But we've moved away from watchful waiting without necessarily having a robust scientific consensus behind that, as we're starting to see from some of the European countries that are a little ahead of us in this. And so now with the rush into gender-affirming care, we're seeing that is being mandated politically, and families who want to follow the prior approach, or families who want a therapist that aligns with their religious convictions, cannot even seek that in Colorado. And that's a real problem.
This has tended to be in the last really 10 years that every issue is a political issue. And so we have to take sides and we have to be right. And those become stark dichotomies, right? It's all or nothing. And if you give a little bit, then the other side. This becomes particularly problematic when we get to issues of physical and mental health that we seem to continue to come back to. This is a trained therapist, right? People are going to this therapist voluntarily. I'm not sure of the point when the state needs to step in and say, you can't do this. Now, there is also the issue, I think, that Joy said, when we have good data on things, we're supposed to use data to make decisions.
Yeah.
There are aspects of this that do get complicated, right? Aspects of therapy, as we've seen in the past 20, 30 years, dealing with sexuality, right? Gender is a different aspect of this, but right, pray the gay away, or if you just go to this, or conversion therapy. We have a lot of data on that, of the way that is done and the harms that come. I think we look at that, but we tend to not allow nuance and complexity when we deal with human lives, because we're just right, and you have to take a position. And increasingly, that seems to negate children and our concern for children. And man, I just can't believe that we can't all come together with helping children, even when we're not sure exactly what that is. But when the point is helping children, I just think that changes the conversation. It's no longer, well, we have to make a point and we're right. And both sides seem to do this more often than not.
We have a couple, I think, of issues here. One is an increase in the population, but when you look at what is the population, the data that I've looked at says that it's about 1% of individuals aged 13 and older identify as transgender, and about 3.3% are between the ages of 13 to 17. When you're talking about counseling, I can't imagine a more troubling issue in the minds of a child or an adolescent than who am I and where do I fit into this mix? So counseling, I could see as being incredibly, incredibly important. But when you then start talking about prescribing a regime of drugs or hormones or surgeries, at that age, that to me is a different conversation, because we don't know in the moment how much of this is truly a child saying, I'm a gender trapped in the wrong body, versus I see this as a trend or a fad that I could very well grow out of at some point in time. So before you start making serious medical decisions and taking serious medical action, I think the child should be older than 13, 14, or 15.
Yeah.
But again, counseling, I think, is exactly what the child and the family would need in this situation.
You know, Joy, there was a time that it used to be all about what's in the best interest of the child. You know, all things used to lean in that direction, but it seems now that we're leaning more into, well, what's the best interest of the political establishment of a political jurisdiction? And that seems to be what's trying to really force its way into the day. And it just seems to me like that's just kind of a bridge too far.
I think it is a bridge too far. And I think it also fits into this larger trend where the customer is always right and we commodify every industry. I mean, we see this in the higher education world as well. I think it's true in healthcare. Rather than the doctor being the one actually in charge and diagnosing, it's now the child coming and saying, I'm experiencing this. And the doctor is being forced, really to acknowledge whatever the child says is completely accurate and true. And there's a lot of benefit, of course, in trusting your patient, understanding your patient. But the idea that we really don't trust experts anymore. And instead we believe that the student, the child, the customer, whatever it is always right. And everything that they're experiencing and feeling must be 100% true. I think that's a larger trend. And I think that trend overall needs some pushback, because we have seen some real problems with experts and how experts kind of misuse their power sometimes. But we also do need to have trust in institutions and experts, and those institutions need to work to rebuild that trust.
Yeah.
And one of the ways to do that is to avoid this politicization that you're talking about.
Well, one of the things that I think that would capture some of this conversation is agenda. There are agendas here that are being promoted. And when you're promoting an agenda, then the data doesn't matter nearly as much. Please don't confuse me with the facts, because I have an agenda that I'm promoting. We could look at this in terms of inoculations. And, we don't need the hepatitis B at birth. I have an agenda, even though that has proven empirically to be a very valuable inoculation. So, and now they want to talk about doing away with the polio vaccine. So again, I think agendas are at play here, and when they are, the data tends to take a back seat.
Jennifer, one of the things that really I'm struggling with this is there was a time where you felt like as a parent, there were things you were supposed to be doing as it related to your children. every idea that popped in their heads was actually not a good idea. And so it seems like a lot of the activity now is getting you in a position where you can no longer even parent based on what you believe in your household. It seems like even society is pushing into that part of our lives.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely is another piece of this, right? It's basically the state telling the parent, you can't choose a therapist that aligns with your biblical or religious understanding of gender. So it's the state coming in and telling parents how to parent. And, that's problematic. And I understand, right, that it may be that the state has this view of conversion therapy because conversion therapy is such a broad term, and it includes and has included so many things and things that really were harmful. But we have to be careful with how we define things, and there's a difference between conversation and therapy versus some of the harmful treatments that were done in the past. And the state has taken this blanket approach to all of this. And it's not just Colorado, right? There are other states. For example, Michigan, where I am right now, there's a similar lawsuit that is going on regarding, the use of conversion therapy by therapists. And so whatever happens here is going to have broad implications moving forward, not just for the child who is, I think, at the heart of all of this, but also for the parents who are trying to raise their children the best way that they know.
I'll have to let that be the last word, but I think one of the issues that we're trying to find in our society, what's the proper balance between protecting children and also allowing parents to parent? We always want to talk about the family being in a position to be powerful in this world, but if we get to the point where parents aren't even allowed to tell their children what's right and wrong anymore, then I think we got a lot of bigger problems we're going to have to deal with. Hey, Joy, tell me something I don't know.
Did you know that every single U.S. president has owned a pet except for one, James K. Polk?
No, I didn't know that. Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. Did you know that the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom has issued a report? And in that report, they found that countries that target religious communities and that violate religious freedom rights, that in those countries, there's a higher risk of mass killings and atrocities occurring.
Wow. Andrew, tell me something I don't know.
Orland, did you know, when we talk about socialization and loneliness, Switzerland has decided that if you own a guinea pig, you must own more than one guinea pig because they're social animals, and so they get lonely and they consider it animal cruelty. So if one of your guinea pigs dies, you can actually rent another guinea pig so it doesn't stay lonely, or you get a fine.
Wow. Wilmer, tell me something I don't know.
Well, let's see. I can tell you that honey never spoils. I can tell you that your stomach acid can dissolve razor blades. And I can also tell you that a day on Venus is longer than its year.
Wow. Thanks for all that information. And thank you again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.